Welcome to the Brainbox podcast. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that brings humanities scholarship to the general public. You can check out the other programs of Oklahoma Humanities at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll, a program officer at Oklahoma Humanities. Brainbox is a podcast for your noggin. It's meant to challenge our on-air guests to make the humanities relevant to today, and challenge listeners to use their Brainbox to make better sense of current events. We talk to experts in humanities fields like history, philosophy, literature, and ethics, who give informed views on the deeper historical and cultural contexts of world events. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard, and you can also find all of our previous episodes by going to our website, okhumanities.org/brainbox, and we're on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, YouTube, Spotify, and other podcasting libraries. And you can email comments and questions to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Underwriting support for this episode of Brainbox is provided by The Springer Company, an Oklahoma company specializing in payroll and bookkeeping for small employers, nonprofits, and local government agencies. For more information, visit thespringercompany.com. In this episode, we'll be talking about the unique history and challenges of Oklahoma's criminal justice system, and we'll look for explanations of how we've come to live with what our guest identifies as the most punitive justice system in the world. Our guest is Ryan Gentzler, the director of Open Justice Oklahoma. For over 2 years, Ryan served as a policy analyst focused on criminal justice at Oklahoma Policy Institute, where he was responsible for research on topics including sentencing, incarceration, court fines and fees, and pretrial detention. Open Justice Oklahoma grew out of Ryan's groundbreaking analysis of court records, which was used to inform critical policy debates. Ryan holds a Master of Public Administration degree from the University of Oklahoma. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're so glad you're here. You've driven all the way from Tulsa to Oklahoma City for this episode, so we really appreciate it. I'm going to editorialize just for a second up front here to mention Ryan has written a really powerful article in our newest Oklahoma Humanities magazine about some of the explanations for Oklahoma's #1 ranking in mass incarceration. Ryan's article is called Between You and Me, and it's available on our website at okhumanities.org/publications. If you email us at brainbox@okhumanities.org, I'll be glad to mail you a free copy of our new issue. So, Ryan, can we start by talking about how Oklahoma's criminal justice statistics and our practices kind of compare with national statistics and trends?
Yeah, we compare very unfavorably in a lot of ways. Basically, every way that we can measure Oklahoma is more punitive than any other place in the United States, and by that token, the entire world. So our incarceration rate is about, by the latest statistics of 2016, 1,310 Oklahomans per 100,000 adults are incarcerated in either prison, which are state facilities where people who have been convicted of serious felonies are held, or in jails, which are local institutions where people usually before they've been convicted of a crime, detained before up until the resolution of their case. So in those two broad categories of incarceration, we are far above the national average, which is about 850 per 100,000 adults. So 1,310 is about 50% higher or more. When you look at the female incarceration rate, our incarceration rate's is more than twice what the national female incarceration rate is. And that's not a new development. What we've always been kind of head and shoulders above the rest of the country when it comes to incarceration. But that's we're really at a point now where it's just so far above the norm, and without the resources to do the kinds of rehabilitation that we expect the criminal justice system to do, that it's really causing a lot of issues that pretty much the whole state is paying attention to now.
Is it possible to put that in some kind of historical context? I'm just curious, are there any historic parallels where a society in another time period where this massive a number of people have been incarcerated?
No. Yes and no. So there are some sort of historical comparisons. The closest thing you can get is probably the authoritarian police states that we like to vilify and think of as incredibly barbaric, and especially in Oklahoma, where we value our privacy and we value our small government so much. If we want to look for kind of historical analogs, we have to look at Soviet states, East Germany, the USSR, places where they had thousands, a substantial portion of the population working spying on their neighbors, essentially, in order to keep this tight authoritarian control over a population. When it comes to democracies like ours, there's really nothing that approaches what the United States does, much less Oklahoma.
That is a stark answer. I'm sort of pausing, thinking about that right now. Your article in our magazine describes what you call some basically unsatisfying and primarily partisan explanations that we often hear for why Oklahoma is number one in incarceration. Can you talk about some of those sort of surface explanations and why they don't really tell the whole story?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's generally two partisan explanations coming from each side of the political spectrum for why our incarceration rate is so high. The first one from the conservative, often the conservative point of view, is that people just need to obey the law. We wouldn't have a high incarceration rate if people just did what they were supposed to do. So the people who are using drugs, who are stealing things, they deserve to be punished and harshly for what they're doing. So we wouldn't have an incarceration problem if people would just behave. That's kind of the first, and we're doing this to keep ourselves safe.
It's their fault, not our society's
fault.
But...
Right. It's all on the individual. The other explanation coming from the more liberal side usually goes something like, we have this war on drugs that Nixon started and Reagan kind of ramped up, where we're just sending thousands of people to prison for long periods of time for smoking a joint, and we have this complete over-incarceration problem just based on drug policies that developed over the last 30 years or so, and that we're now starting to undo, but there's still a lot of work to be done in that regard. So I think there's some merit. There's something to be said for both sides of both of those arguments, but I think they both simplify things far too much to really be satisfying to a person who's trying to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I really want to talk about the deeper reasons that you've identified. But first, might be a left field question, but do you ever come across any compelling arguments for mass incarceration? Is anybody defending our current system and saying we should be number one?
Compelling arguments, no.
Okay.
But there are certainly arguments. There's a contingent that says, we can't just let people out of prison. That's essentially what the argument is. And there was an article in I think it was the Conservative Review, just 2 weeks ago. It's a national magazine, and it was the editor writing about a case in Oklahoma, and the the headline was something like Oklahoma has an under-incarceration problem, which is, a very clickbaity sort of way to frame his argument. But, it probably worked because I certainly clicked on it. But what his argument was based on a single case where a man who had been kind of in and out of the justice system for the last 10 years, mostly minor crimes, but maybe some stuff that we would consider more serious. He did spend some time in prison. I think released in 2011 or something. He was pulled over by the police in Oklahoma City, I believe, and ended up causing a wreck. Basically, was fleeing, ended up causing a wreck, killed a couple people. Very, very tragic, awful story. But the upshot for this writer was that if that person had been in prison rather than out on the streets driving, those two people would still be alive. Which,
it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah,
I guess on
sure.
some level. Yeah.
The problem is that our justice system really does a terrible job of distinguishing between that person and the thousands of people who have very similar records, who are not not a threat
Right.
to public safety. I think we could do a better job of figuring out who those real threats to society are. But, what we're doing now is just throwing a very, very wide net and then hoping that we catch the right people.
Well, there are two key aspects of Oklahoma's identity that you've identified that are kind of deeper explanations of how we've constructed and sustained the most punitive justice system in the world, as you called it. And you describe these aspects as, in some way, the flip side of values that we as Oklahomans take pride in. These are two issues that can be kind of difficult to talk about, but maybe we can first tackle what you've called Oklahoma's homegrown religious philosophy.
Yeah, I think it wasn't my idea originally. I just thought it was really compelling it was something that struck me when I was reading a piece in the Tulsa Voice last year. It was an interview with Jill Webb, who is the legal director for the ACLU of Oklahoma, and one of the most passionate and effective advocates for criminal justice reform, that you'll ever meet. And what she was explaining to the interviewer was this theory, and she kind of brought it up out of nowhere, which I thought was really fascinating, because obviously she's just about the smartest person you'll ever meet, and you can tell she's just been mulling this for a long time. She's from Texas originally, so very much in a similar culture to Oklahoma. As opposed to me, who comes from Nebraska, but have adopted this place as my home. But what Jill was saying was that there's this gospel of individualism. The prosperity gospel teaches you that if you are faithful enough to God, that you will be rewarded on earth with riches, with prosperity. You'll be rich. You'll have a mansion in a pool, just like your favorite televangelist does. This philosophy provides people with a lot of hope. People who are struggling economically, who are struggling in their daily lives. If I just have enough faith, I can achieve all this comfort, all this wealth, all these good things on earth. And so it does provide hope. On the flip side of that, I think what Jill was saying is that, if that's the case, if all we have to do is be faithful, is have a faith in God, then, we don't need to worry about what's happening to our neighbor. If they're in trouble, it means that they're just not faithful enough, and I don't need to worry about that. So, I think there's something to that. I don't think and I think, as a social scientist, there's probably some co-occurring factors here. So maybe there's something deeper that's causing both of those things. But I think they're definitely part of the same story. And if we want to, address our incarceration rate, we need to start thinking about why we've been okay with our incarceration rate up to this point.
Another key aspect that you've identified has to do with the state's identity. It's led to mass incarceration, probably, and that's persistent racial bias. I wanted to ask if you could relate an anecdote from your article about talking with a group of young people about what it means that Oklahoma incarcerates 1,310 people per 100,000 residents.
Yeah, I think I stare at these statistics a lot all day. It's my job. So, 1,310 means something to me because it's so much higher than any other place. But I think to the average person who hears, incarceration rate and 700 per 100,000, 1,300 per 100,000, it's really difficult to wrap our minds around those numbers. They're not things that they're not in a form that we understand readily. But if you just divide it out, 100, so it's 1.3 people per 100, or over 1% of the population. So I graduated from a very small high school in Nebraska with 140 people. That would mean about one or two people from my class would be incarcerated if they were, from Oklahoma. And so, but I don't think, so we were at the Summer Policy Institute, which brings together, I think it's about 60 students, college students, graduate or undergrad, to talk about policy issues for 4 days. And so I wanted to see how many people in the audience were actually had 1% of their Facebook friends who were incarcerated currently. And so I asked the question, so if you have 500 Facebook friends, do you know 5 people who are in prison or in jail? And so I just asked that. There's about 60 people in the audience. About 12 hands went up, and they all belonged to students of color. It was our African American students, our Hispanic students, and that's I was trying to make the point that us as I come from a upper middle class background. I'm a white guy, and I certainly don't know 1% of my acquaintances who are incarcerated. But if you go to the communities of color in Oklahoma, it's much more than 1%. When you look at the statistics, the incarceration rate for white Oklahomans is actually less than the national average.
Huh.
If you look at the incarceration rate for black people in Oklahoma, it's very high. It's about 4% of black people in Oklahoma who are incarcerated. I mean, that's just an astounding sort of illustration of the disproportionate effect that that our justice system has on those communities of color.
There's a term I think I came across in your article that mass incarceration has been called the most important civil rights issue of our time. And I know you studied some specific issues like over-policing and court fines and fees and pretrial detention that probably the vast majority of our listening audience and I am not super familiar with because I don't have a lot of contact with the criminal justice system. But what are some aspects of those policies that you think would surprise people that aren't intimately familiar with the criminal justice system here?
Yeah, there's just so many dynamics in the criminal justice system that all kind of point in only one direction, and that's towards greater punishment of people who become involved in the justice system. So when we think about, if we just talk about the very beginning of the process about law enforcement, we know that law enforcement disproportionately stops people in communities of color. In Tulsa, it's North Tulsa. It's a very heavily policed part of the world, and it really stems from. If you look at a crime map in Tulsa, it's pretty evenly spread out across the city. There's, but the thing about enforcement is that you find crime where you look for it. There's, all of the disproportionately huge amount of drug arrests in North Tulsa. But we know from surveys that drug use isn't any higher in communities of color, in low-income communities, than it is in higher-income communities. Higher-income communities just don't get policed in the same way. And so, just from that, we have a large police presence in communities of color, kind of with only one tool towards to control crime, and that's arrest, that's stops and frisks and all those sorts of things. And so that's what gets done. We focus our resources on communities of color, so that's where we cast the net, and that's where we catch the fish. After a person is arrested, they will be taken to jail. They will have bail set, and if the person can afford that bail, they can pay for their release either through a bond, which is a non-refundable 10% of the bail amount. So, if it's $500, $50 to get out, but you don't get those $50 back. Often, it can be $5,000, $10,000. So you're talking about, $500, $1,000. The people who can pay that will pay it because being in jail is a nightmare. And the people who can pay that are disproportionately white. They're from more prosperous backgrounds. They have more access to friends and family who have resources that can pitch in. And so, from that, in that step two, it's just very difficult for people of color to buy their freedom, essentially. Of course, we know that in our prisons and jails, communities of color are far overrepresented. But even if a person doesn't get a sentence of incarceration, if they're simply fined or put on probation, something like that, there's these massive amounts of fines and fees that a person has to pay in connection with their case if they're convicted. So there's, not just the fine, which is usually just a small portion of what they owe. There's also dozens of fees that are put on top of that. So there's several $100s in court costs, often, which go to fund the courts that just convicted them. There's DA fees that fund the prosecutor that just convicted them. There's or prosecuted them. There's a public defender fee to pay for the lawyer that you couldn't afford. There's all sorts of fees that go to all sorts of state agencies because we just don't have the money to fund those things otherwise. So, we did a study that found that of all the people in Tulsa County who were convicted of a felony in 2008, by 2018, 2/3 of those people had a failure to pay warrant. So they had fallen behind on paying their court costs, 2/3 of them, and were at risk for being arrested and incarcerated for not being able to pay those fines and fees. It's not just some niche issue. It is the majority of people who are going through the justice system who are dealing with this. We did some maps of where the court debt is in Oklahoma, in Oklahoma County and in Tulsa County. The extent to which that debt is concentrated in the lower income communities, mostly Black communities in Oklahoma and Tulsa County, it's just astounding. It's I think it was like $800 per resident in certain zip codes. So man, woman, child. If you divide out all the debt just owed to the courts, it's not including DA fees, supervision fees, monitoring fees that were paid to DOC, just to the courts, hundreds of dollars, millions, hundreds of dollars per person, millions of dollars in total, just hanging over with absolutely no benefit to the people who are paying it. It's one thing if they owe medical debt because they got sick and had to have treatment. It's another thing if it's a payday loan or something, which is also extremely problematic. But at least they got something out of that transaction. Right. In this case, it's millions of dollars just being sucked out of communities with no real benefit, and it really goes to reinforce this feeling that this justice system really just wants to get me. It's not there to keep anybody safe, to rehabilitate anybody who needs rehabilitation. It's really just there, to keep the foot on the neck of the communities that it's affecting most. Because
does that funding go directly back to the criminal justice system itself?
Directly back to it. So about half of what they collect goes to the courts themselves. So the judges who are deciding what they're sentenced with, the prosecutors who can recommend DA supervision, which is a form of probation. They can recommend a person for DA supervision and then collect $40 per month from each person they put on DA supervision. They get about 20 to 30% of their budget from those fees. They can't operate without those fees. There just is not enough money there to do it. So, the bad incentives here are just glaringly obvious. And this is actually one thing that Governor Stitt has pinpointed as a priority, and they're trying to put more general appropriation dollars, more tax dollars into the DA, so they don't have to depend on this revenue. But to some extent, the damage is already done. It's it's a very important dynamic that I don't think is very well understood.
I'd love to put some information on our website about some deeper statistics and analysis of that issue, particularly. Kind of jumping from topic to topic here in the limited time that we have, I'm curious about your analysis of our especially high rate of female incarceration. We had a great guest a few episodes ago, Dr. Bob Blackburn from the Oklahoma Historical Society. He's the executive director. And we talked about a lot of aspects of what makes up Oklahoma's identity, Oklahoma's DNA, as he calls it. And he gave a really interesting answer about why he thinks our female incarceration rate is so high. So I kind of wanted to bounce that off of you. He mentioned that part of our state's heritage is a large number of evangelicals who settled the state and continue to. There are a high population in Oklahoma, and his analysis is that evangelicals and others put women on a pedestal, and we typically defend their honor. And the flip side of that is more is expected of women morally, and if women make a mistake, they're punished more severely. Would you see that as maybe part of the explanation for our high female incarceration rate?
I think that's dead on. I think it's a very, very important. Absolutely, I think that's most of it, if not all of it. One thing that Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform and the Oklahoma Women's Coalition and Oklahoma Policy Institute, to some extent, has been looking at and made a legislative priority over the last several years is to look at failure to protect laws. So failure to protect happens when a parent does not take their children out of the home of an abusive parent. So it should work both ways, right? If a father is abusing his children and the mother is not, almost always, if not always, the mother's also being abused. But if the mother doesn't protect her children, that should fall under this. If a mother's abusing her children and a father doesn't protect, you would expect the dynamic to work both ways. It absolutely doesn't. There are hundreds of women in Oklahoma prisons. That's difficult to pinpoint because the records aren't kept very well, distinguishing failure to protect or enabling or allowing child abuse versus actually perpetrating child abuse. But what we see, if I can get back onto my train of thought, but hundreds of women are in prisons in Oklahoma for failure to protect their children. How many men? None that we know of. And so
none.
No, I mean, I would challenge anybody to find a person if they did. But we know that this is a real problem, and it only goes one way. If the father is abusing the children and the mother, allows it to happen, in the jury's eyes, that woman's going to be punished for it. And it's, it doesn't. There's the dynamics of domestic violence are extremely complicated, and I don't think that we as a culture really appreciate how difficult it is for women who are abused to leave relationships, and so we as a culture, as Oklahomans, look at these things as they happen. And we think, oh, how could that mother let that happen? She must be a terrible mother, a terrible person, if she, because I would do anything for my kids, and that's usually the line. I would do anything to protect my kids. If she's not doing that, there must be something wrong with her. We need to to make her hurt for it.
Hmm.
So it's there's some pretty high profile cases around this. Tondaleo Hall is one of them. She was sentenced back several years ago for her. She was being abused by her partner. Her child ended up passing away, and she was, and her partner, who had been abusive towards her and the child, got I think 6 months probation, something like that, 6 years, I don't know, something like that. Tondaleo Hall got something like 30 years in prison. So it's it's this massive just imbalance in the culpability of a man in this situation who was actually doing the abuse, and the woman who was clearly suffering herself, being blamed for everything that happened.
I really wanted to ask too about from your studies and your analysis. I was wondering what you would consider some of the key ripple effects of mass incarceration. Like how does it affect our broader society, our families and schools, and our state's budget even? What are the key ripple effects that you might identify?
There are, it's just, it completely permeates everything about our culture. And in families, it's, our over-incarceration creates just massive amounts of trauma within families. A person who's or a child who grows up without a parent, mother or father, is much more likely to have adverse social outcomes. A child who has an incarcerated parent has a 7 times greater chance of becoming incarcerated themselves as an adult. 7 times. That's what the research shows, and it's and so it's just on the micro level, we're just creating lots and lots of traumatized, under-supported children. If you zoom out a little bit and look at the community, there was a sociologist, Bruce Western, who I quoted in my piece, who said, there's our over-incarceration has completely warped our sense of reality, because there are so many, especially black men, missing from society, that it just completely warps how we see black communities. There was something, if we're taking out black men, providers, earners out of the community, we're just on top of all the fines and fees, on top of all the obstacles that we place in front of people of color in our economy, we have just massive amounts of mostly young black men who are in their prime earning years, being just taken out of society. So it just completely distorts, for instance, unemployment statistics, because if we have 25%, black men are already have a higher unemployment rate than white men. But if you take out but in the official statistics, we take out those incarcerated people. So if we include them and we say they're also unemployed, the unemployment rate for black men just skyrockets, because it just completely distorts. It's just such a substantial part of the population that it's mind-boggling. It really is almost impossible to get our minds around how deep the effects of our over-incarceration run.
One aspect of the criminal justice system that I think probably a lot of people aren't familiar with, I'm not super familiar with it, are the aspect of rehabilitation or preparation for prisoners to re-enter society. What are some of the effects of how Oklahoma currently practices this prison rehabilitation, if any? How do you feel about how we're doing on that aspect?
Yeah, again, not very well. If you look at the amount of money that goes to the Department of Corrections, so Department of Corrections is responsible for about 27,000 people who are incarcerated in state prisons, responsible for correcting them. It's the Department of Corrections.
Good point. I had not thought about that word.
Right, yeah, I mean, it's right there in the title. And so, we're supposed to, like, that's supposed to be the place where we prepare people who need to be straightened out, need to be corrected, to become rehabilitated. Instead, what we see is just warehousing. So we have, over the last, it changed a little bit last year because we had a big tax package that passed, and we were able to invest more in the prisons. But before that, between about 2008 and 2017 or so, the amount of money that was going to the Department of Corrections was basically the same. So it didn't grow any in 10 years period. During that time, the prison population grew by about 25%. So we have people being stacked on top of people, with no additional resources being sent to the agency that's supposed to be rehabilitating them. That should not sit well with anybody. We know that 90% of people who go to the Department of Corrections are going to come out someday. They're going to be our neighbors. This is not, even on a very selfish basis, we should be much more concerned about what's happening in our prisons, because we should want them we should be giving them all the resources they need to make sure a person lives a successful crime-free life after they come out. We are absolutely not doing that. The number of people who are in prison who have mental health and substance abuse issues coming in, just a tiny fraction of them get the sort of treatment that they need to get, even on the most basic level, to get healthy, to recover somewhat in that aspect. There's no resources even for the most basic things. That's not to say that the Department of Corrections isn't doing all they can with the limited resources they have. I think, they have been dealt a terrible, terrible hand that they don't really have much of a say in. But it's just very difficult to make these sorts of investments when we're so focused on keeping taxes low, keeping the government out of our business. That doesn't it just doesn't really work when it comes to these really tough social issues that affect all of us.
If it's possible to maybe end on a positive note, or a few positive notes, you've written about new approaches to criminal justice and overturning the perception that being quote-unquote tough on crime is linked to preventing crime. Could you talk a little bit about your analysis of the Oklahoma City Police Department's strategies that for reducing crime and incarceration that may be effective? Yeah,
there are lots of I say lots of. There are some very encouraging. There are some very encouraging developments around the state. The Oklahoma City Police Department is one of them. Under Chief City, who's unfortunately leaving, retiring. Good for him. But this shift towards solving problems rather than being kind of on the being oppositional is really a really promising development. Mm-hmm. So Oklahoma City Police Department has said, we're just not going to arrest people on failure to pay warrants anymore. We're just not. We're not going to make that part of our. If somebody has a failure to pay warrant, we'll give them a reminder for their court date. We'll deal with it. We'll address it, but we're not going to arrest them, bring them to jail, and hold them there for a week in the Oklahoma County Jail, which is in not the best condition. But instead, we're just gonna focus on the problems that matter. And I think that's the type of response that we need to have, and we need to bring that mindset to a much. We need to apply that sort of mindset on a much broader scale when it comes to our justice system. How do we use our public institutions, our public resources to solve problems, to focus on the things that, as the phrase goes, to focus on the people that we're afraid of, not that we're mad at. So, we still have about 1,800 to 1,000 people in our prisons who were convicted of simple drug possession. Even though that's now a misdemeanor after State Question 780 passed, old convictions can still lead to very low-level offenses being, ending up in prison. So, that's not a great use of our resources. We know, and there are tons of examples around the country who have turned this around, who have said, let's invest in rehabilitation, in substance abuse services, in mental health services on the front end, and it pays big dividends on the back end. And Oklahoma is getting there. It's just taking, it's taking too long. And it's, we're still fighting every day and every legislative session to move that ball forward.
This is purely on an anecdotal level from a friend of mine who was an Oklahoma City police officer. And I was really impressed and surprised, kind of stunned when he was explaining to me the lengths that he will go to not get a kid into the criminal justice system. A kid who's maybe committed a crime. I mean, we're talking about, a minor. He will go to extreme lengths to put a kid on his basketball team, to meet with him after school, to not get him into the criminal justice system because he knows what the result of that first step into the criminal justice system will likely end up in. So I've heard anecdotal evidence as well of Oklahoma City taking a different approach. I think in your article, you also note some other recent signs of a move away from mass incarceration in Oklahoma that on the statewide level as well.
Right. Yeah, I think State Question 780 and 781 were really the beginning of that. Back in 2016, Oklahoma voters approved two ballot measures. One was State Question 780, which made a simple drug possession a misdemeanor rather than a felony, no matter how many offenses, and as well as some low-level property crimes. So made those misdemeanors rather than felonies, meaning they're not eligible for prison sentences anymore. And that passed by, a very healthy margin, 16 points or something. And it really, I think, gave confidence to lawmakers to really really start doing some things through the legislative process to to contribute to bringing our incarceration rate down. So the Governor Fallon back in 2016 put together a task force to put together some justice reforms that would bring our incarceration rate down. Those stalled in 2017, but they passed stalled in 2017. All the years run together now, and we're passed finally in 2018, and those will slow prison growth substantially by bringing some sentencing down. But really, the biggest area for reducing the incarceration rate is actually investing more heavily in probation. A huge portion of the people who are coming into prison, I think it's about a third of the people who end up in prison, were not sentenced originally to prison. They were sentenced to some sort of community supervision. They weren't able to follow the compliance, which includes paying your fines and fees, passing drug tests, checking in with your probation officer. A huge number of the people who are coming into prison simply need better support, better supervision. If we know if a person is high risk, a high risk offender, we need to have more support. We need to be checking in with them more. We need to have we need to give them more support to find a job, to deal with whatever mental health or substance abuse issues they have. And people with less intense needs, less so. We can do this smartly, and that's really where the big gains can be made in reducing incarceration. Is moving those resources to the front, doing them with evidence-based practices, with smart, allocation of resources, and that's exactly what Texas did to reduce their incarceration rate, which was just skyrocketing in 2007 when they started their justice reform process. They were going to need, I think, 3 new prisons or something. They ended up closing several prisons over the last 10 years because they just tried a new approach and it worked.
Are there any other strategies or solutions that you've run across, even in other countries, perhaps, that are maybe particular favorites that you've run across that might be interesting to try?
Oh yeah, I mean it seems kind of pie in the sky to talk about what's going on in in Scandinavia, but you see like what they're doing, and they live people. First of all, it's a tiny fraction. I mean, I'm talking like 5% of our, like, proportional to our population. It's like their incarceration rate is like 5 or 10% of what ours is. And so it's the very most, what we would think of as scary or threatening. People who have done very violent things usually. And they're just, and there's documentary crews that go in there and talk to them, and they're it's this inmate who's standing next to this row of kitchen knives because he's training to be a chef, and he's just standing there talking to the documentary crew, and they're like, aren't you like there's knives right there? And it's like, yeah, so what? I mean, it's the most successful criminal justice or penal systems treat people like humans. They don't make them live in a trash can. They don't make them live in places that are falling apart. The philosophy here is like make them hate their time in prison so much that they never want to come back, which is it's just the opposite of what our human brain like responds well to. It doesn't work. The most successful penal systems treat people like humans and really invest in and make prison life like real life. Give people the same kind of challenges, opportunities that they would have in real life. Obviously, it's a more controlled environment, but make them, make them believe and train themselves to live successfully, and that's kind of the opposite of what we're doing here.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate this conversation. And I wonder, would you like to talk a little bit about your work at Open Justice Oklahoma and with the Oklahoma Policy Institute?
Yeah. So I'm the director of Open Justice Oklahoma, which is a program that takes massive amounts of court data and jail data and prison data and turns that into insight about the justice system. We have an amazing court website, oscn.net, where you can learn what's going on in any case across the state. But no one's using that information to really understand anything on a broad level. So what Open Justice Oklahoma does is gather all that information and use data science methods to kind of identify the problems and the potential solutions to our justice and court-related problems. So that's on the criminal side. It's looking at what happened after State Question 780. Our research found that there was a 29% drop in felony filings after that went into effect. So about 29% of our felonies were driven by these drug possession or low-level property crimes. So I mean that's
good to know.
That's 14,000 felony cases that were avoided just by this one reform.
Wow.
And yeah, it's good to know. And no one did before we put out a report. So, it's we're working on a lot of interesting things, and our website is openjusticeok.org, and our parent organization, OK Policy, okpolicy.org, does tons of research and advocacy on all sorts of public policy issues, criminal justice, but also budget and taxes, education policy, economic opportunity, healthcare, and we have a newsletter that goes out every weekday in the know. With policy and political news. So you can sign up for that on our website, okpolicy.org.
Great. And we'll put links to all that information on our the website for this, the webpage for this particular episode. So thank you for mentioning that. And again, if you're interested in checking out Ryan's article, Between You and Me, it's available on our website at okhumanities.org/publications. And if you email us at brainbox@okhumanities.org, I'll personally mail you a free copy of it. We encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the Brainbox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/Brainbox website, and on social media by using hashtag BrainboxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios, where we record. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Lauren Nixon, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities or our underwriters. This has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin.